Mason Hale was broke. The single dad barely had enough money for his plane ticket home when he saw her collapse at gate 22. A woman in designer clothes was having a panic attack on the airport floor. Everyone walked past her like she didn't exist. Mason didn't hesitate. He knelt down and helped her breathe through it with the same calm voice he used when his toddler had nightmares. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't want anything in return. What he didn't know was that he'd just saved Sierra Wrenfield, one of the richest women in America, a billionaire who'd been drowning in her perfect life until a stranger with kind eyes pulled her back to shore. Sierra never forgot his face, and when she tracked him down weeks later, what she discovered about his struggles would change both their lives forever. But would a man with nothing accept help from a woman who had everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mason Hale's alarm clock didn't work anymore, but he didn't need it. Emma's cries at 5:30 every morning served the same purpose, cutting through the thin walls of their one-bedroom apartment like a knife through silence. He rolled out of the pull-out couch that doubled as his bed, his back protesting the cheap springs, and padded barefoot across the cold linoleum to her crib. "Morning, sunshine," he whispered, lifting his 18-month-old daughter into his arms. Her fever had broken sometime during the night, a small mercy in a life that seemed to ration them carefully. The stack of medical bills on his kitchen counter had grown thicker over the past month, each envelope a reminder of Emma's chronic respiratory condition and his inability to provide everything she needed. The apartment smelled like instant coffee and resignation. Mason had moved here after Sarah left, when Emma was 6 months old, and the diagnosis was still fresh. Sarah had looked at their daughter's medical chart like it was a death sentence, looked at Mason like he was supposed to fix it, and when he couldn't, she simply stopped looking at either of them altogether. "She needs too much," Sarah had said the morning she packed her bags. "I can't do this, Mason. I can't watch her struggle every day." But Mason could. He would. He had to. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Emma settled into her high chair, gnawing on a piece of toast that cost him 47 cents. He'd calculated the cost of everything lately, every meal, every diaper, every minute of daycare while he worked construction sites around the city. The math never added up in his favor. His phone buzzed against the counter. A text from his foreman. "Sites flooded from last night's rain. No work today." Mason stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. No work meant no pay, and no pay meant the electric company would make good on their threat to shut off his power. He looked at Emma, who was humming to herself and dropping toast crumbs to the floor, blissfully unaware that their world was held together with duct tape and stubborn hope. Meanwhile, across the city, Sierra Wrenfield stood in her corner office, on the 42nd floor, watching the same sunrise paint the windows of buildings that looked like toy blocks from her height. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming, but she felt none of that clarity herself. The morning briefing folder sat unopened on her mahogany desk. Stock reports, acquisition proposals, board meeting agendas. All of it felt as distant as the tiny cars moving through the streets below. Her assistant, Patricia, knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission, a habit Sierra had given up correcting years ago. "Your mother called," Patricia said, setting down a cup of coffee that cost more than Mason's weekly grocery budget. "She wants to know if you'll attend the charity gala next month." Sierra didn't look away from the window. "Which charity?" "Children's. Hospital, I think. Does it matter? It should matter." Sierra owned 3 homes, 2 jets, and a media empire that reached millions of people daily. She could write a check that would fund an entire wing of any hospital, and often did. But standing in her pristine office, surrounded by awards and accolades, she felt as empty as the apartment she went home to each night. "Tell her yes," Sierra said finally. "And Patricia, clear my schedule for lunch. You have the Hartman acquisition meeting at 1. Move it." Patricia hesitated in the doorway. In 5 years of working together, Sierra had never moved a meeting. For lunch, had rarely taken lunch at all. "Are you feeling well?" Sierra turned from the window, and for a moment Patricia saw something vulnerable in her boss's expression, something almost frightened. But then it was gone, replaced by the composed mask Sierra wore like armor. "I'm fine, just need some air." But Sierra wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for months, maybe years. The panic attacks had started small. Moments of breathlessness during board meetings, tightness in her chest when she walked into crowded rooms. Her doctor had prescribed medication, recommended therapy, suggested she take time off. None of them understood that taking time off meant being alone with thoughts she'd spent a lifetime learning to outrun. The empire she'd built was supposed to be her legacy, her contribution to the world. Instead, it felt like a beautiful prison, and she was both the warden and the only prisoner. Back in his apartment, Mason was explaining to Emma why they couldn't go to the zoo today, trying to make his disappointment sound like adventure. "We're going to have a home day," he said, bouncing her on his knee. "We'll read books and maybe take a walk to the park." Emma clapped her hands, delighted with any plan that involved her father's undivided attention. She didn't know that the zoo cost $15 they didn't have, or that the park was free and therefore their most frequent destination. To her, every day with Daddy was Christmas morning. Mason's phone rang, an unknown number with a local area code, probably another creditor, another polite voice explaining how far behind he was on something essential. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Hale, this is Jennifer from Bright Futures Daycare. I wanted to touch base about Emma's account." His heart sank. "How much do I owe?" "Actually, that's why I'm calling. Your account shows a zero balance as of this morning. Someone made a payment to cover the next 3 months. Mason nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, what?" "A payment was made anonymously. Cash. The person specifically requested that we not identify them, but they wanted Emma's care to continue uninterrupted." "There has to be some mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Hale. Emma's spot is secure through the end of the year." After Jennifer hung up, Mason sat in his kitchen chair, staring at his daughter, who was now contentedly playing with her blocks on the floor. 3 months of daycare, nearly $2,000. Who would do such a thing, and why? He thought about the woman at the airport, the way she'd looked at him when he helped her stand up after her breathing returned to normal. She'd tried to give him money then, pressing a $100 bill into his palm. He'd refused, of course. He wasn't a charity case. But this felt different. This felt like someone who understood that sometimes pride had to take a back seat to love. Emma looked up at him and smiled, her whole face lighting up with the kind of joy that only children could manufacture from thin air. In that moment, Mason made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. He was going to find out who had helped them, and he was going to pay them back. Every penny, because accepting help was one thing, but owing someone was another entirely. And Mason Hale had learned the hard way that people who helped you always wanted something in return. He just hoped he could afford whatever that something turned out to be. The eviction notice was taped to Mason's door when he returned from dropping Emma at daycare, the white paper fluttering in the morning breeze like a surrender flag. His hands shook as he peeled it away from the wood, reading the familiar legal language that boiled down to a simple truth. He had 30 days to come up with 3 months back rent or find somewhere else to live. $2,400. He might as well have been asked to produce the moon. Mason sank onto his front step, the notice crumpled in his fist. Around him, the apartment complex buzzed with the sounds of normal life. Children playing in the courtyard, someone's television too loud, the distant hum of traffic. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching his life happen to someone else. His phone buzzed with a text from his bank. "Your account balance has been updated. Available balance, $12,847.23. Mason stared at the screen, certain there was a mistake. Yesterday his balance had been negative $37. He called the automated line, punched in his account number with trembling fingers, and listened to the computerized voice confirm what the text had said. $12,847. The customer service representative was polite but unhelpful. The deposit was made via wire transfer yesterday evening. No identifying information beyond the routing number, which traces back to a corporate account. The memo line just says, "Emergency assistance." "Can you tell me which company?" "I'm sorry, sir, that information isn't available." Mason hung up and immediately called back, spoke to a different representative, got the same answer. Someone had deposited nearly $13,000 into his account, enough to cover his rent, Emma's medical bills, and keep them afloat for months. Someone who didn't want to be identified. The first emotion was relief, pure and overwhelming. Emma would have a home. The electricity would stay on. The collection calls would stop, at least for a while. The second emotion was panic. Who had this? A kind of money to throw around? What did they want in return? Mason had learned early in life that gifts this size always came with strings attached. And those strings had a way of turning into nooses when you least expected it. He thought about returning the money, but to whom, and with what justification? "Sorry, but my pride is worth more than my daughter's security." Meanwhile, Sierra sat in her office, staring at her computer screen, where the wire transfer confirmation glowed like a small victory. She'd found Mason Hale easily enough. His social security number from the airport incident report had led to employment records, which led to his address, his bank account. His entire financial life laid bare in a matter of hours. The investigation had revealed exactly what she'd expected. A good man drowning in circumstances beyond his control. Medical bills dating back to Emma's birth. A former wife who'd disappeared. Without a trace 6 months ago, leaving no forwarding address and no child support. A work history that showed steady employment until an injury the previous year had left him unable to take on the heaviest construction jobs. Patricia knocked and entered with the morning reports. "The Hartman acquisition papers are ready for your signature." Sierra minimized the screen. "Later. Also, your private investigator called. Something about the airport incident follow-up you requested." "What did he say?" "That the subject has received the assistance package and is actively trying to trace its source." Patricia paused, studying Sierra's face. "Should I be concerned about this?" Sierra turned back to her computer, pulling up a news article about single parents and poverty statistics. "No, it's handled." But it wasn't handled. If anything, Sierra felt more unsettled now than before she'd sent the money. She'd expected to feel satisfaction, the warm glow of having done a good deed. Instead, she felt like a voyeur, someone peering into a life she had no right to examine. The truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about Mason Hale, not because of his circumstances, but because of the way he'd looked at her in that airport, like she was just a person, not a brand or a business opportunity or a networking contact. He'd helped her without knowing who she was, without calculating what he might gain. When was the last time someone had looked at her that way? Her phone rang. Her mother, as predictable as clockwork. "Darling, I've been thinking about the gala. You really should bring someone this time. The Williamson boy is single again, and his father—" "Mother, I'm working." "You're always working, that's the problem. A woman your age should be thinking about family, about legacy. What's the point of building an empire if there's no one to inherit it?" Sierra closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied these conversations. "I need to go. Promise me you'll think about it, about bringing someone, about finding someone worth bringing." After her mother hung up, Sierra sat in the silence of her office, 42 floors above the city, where Mason Hale was probably struggling with the same questions that plagued her. What did people want from her? And could she afford to give it to them? The difference was, Mason's concerns were about survival. Hers were about something much harder to quantify. Back in his apartment, Mason had spread every financial document he owned across his kitchen table, trying to make sense of his sudden windfall. The eviction notice lay smoothed flat beside his. Bank statements, a stark reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything. Emma was napping in her crib, giving him the quiet he needed to think. But thinking only led to more questions, and questions only led to the gnawing certainty that this money came with expectations he couldn't meet. He'd grown up in foster care, shuffled between families who saw him as a monthly check rather than a child. He'd learned early that generosity was rarely free, that people who helped you always kept score. Even Sarah, in the beginning, had made their relationship feel like a transaction, her affection in exchange for his complete devotion, her presence contingent on his ability to make her happy. When Emma got sick and Sarah left, Mason had sworn he'd never depend on anyone again. Better to struggle alone than to owe someone something you couldn't repay. But looking at the bank balance on his phone, he felt his resolve wavering. This wasn't just about him anymore. Emma deserved stability, medical care, a future that wasn't. Constantly threatened by the next unpaid bill. Maybe the person who'd helped them was exactly what they seemed, someone with means who wanted to help a struggling father. Maybe there were still good people in the world who acted without expecting anything in return, or maybe Mason was being naive, and this was just the first move in a game he didn't understand yet. His phone rang. Jennifer from the daycare again. Mr. Hale, I hope you don't mind me calling twice in one day, but we've had another anonymous payment. This time for Emma's medical fund. You know, the emergency account we keep for parents whose children need unexpected care. How much this time? $5,000. Specifically earmarked for Emma Hale. Mason sank into his kitchen chair, feeling like the floor had shifted beneath him. First the daycare, then his bank account, now a medical fund. Someone wasn't just helping. They were orchestrating his entire life from the shadows. Jennifer, if this person contacts you again, will you tell them I'd like to speak with them, that I'm grateful, but I need to understand what's happening? Of course, Mr. Hale. Though honestly, I hope they keep calling. Emma's lucky to have someone looking out for her. After hanging up, Mason looked around his shabby apartment, at the peeling paint and second-hand furniture, at the stack of medical bills that no longer seemed quite so threatening. Someone was looking out for Emma. Someone with enough money to change their lives without thinking twice about it. The question was whether he had the courage to let them, because accepting this help meant admitting he couldn't do it alone. It meant acknowledging that sometimes, despite everything he'd learned about people and their hidden motives, sometimes you had to trust that not everyone wanted to hurt you. Sometimes you had to let people save you, even when you didn't understand why they would want to. The business card arrived in Mason's mailbox on a Tuesday, nestled between a grocery store circular and a reminder notice from Emma's pediatrician. Helping Hands Foundation was embossed in simple black letters across cream-colored cardstock, with an address downtown and a phone number he didn't recognize. The letter that accompanied it was brief and professional. Mr. Hale, we understand you have experience in construction and project management. Our foundation is launching a community center initiative focused on supporting single-parent families. We'd like to discuss a consulting opportunity that might interest you. Please call at your earliest convenience. It was signed by someone named Margaret Stevens, Director of Operations. Mason read the letter 3 times, looking for the catch. Nobody offered consulting work to construction workers who lived in one-bedroom apartments. Nobody found you through anonymous letters unless they already knew more about you than they should. But Emma's medicine cabinet was full for the first time in months, and his rent was current, and the mysterious benefactor had gone quiet for 2 weeks. Maybe this was a coincidence. Maybe his luck was finally changing. He called the number during Emma's afternoon nap. Helping Hands Foundation. This is Margaret. This is Mason Hale. I received a letter about a consulting position. Mr. Hale, thank you so much for calling. We've been hoping to hear from you. Are you available to meet tomorrow afternoon? We're very excited about this project. The foundation's offices occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building that smelled like money and fresh coffee. Margaret Stevens turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a handshake that suggested she'd worked with her hands before sitting behind a desk. She led Mason through a suite of offices that looked too new, too perfectly appointed, like a movie set dressed to look like a real business. "We're just getting started," Margaret explained as they settled. In a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. The foundation was established 6 months ago by an anonymous donor who wanted to focus specifically on infrastructure that supports single-parent families, community centers, childcare facilities, after-school programs. And you need a construction consultant for what exactly? Margaret spread architectural plans across the conference table. "We've purchased a property in the Riverside District, a former community center that's been vacant for 3 years. The building has good bones, but it needs extensive renovation to meet our vision." Mason studied the blueprints, his trained eye automatically cataloging the scope of work involved. New electrical throughout, plumbing upgrades, structural repairs to the main gathering space. It was ambitious but doable. The kind of project that would take 8 months and a crew of skilled tradesmen. "This is a big undertaking," he said finally. "You're looking at $250,000 in renovation costs, maybe more if you run into surprises. Cost isn't our primary concern. Quality is. We want this done right, by people who understand what these families need." Margaret leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mr. Hale, we specifically sought you out because of your background. You understand the challenges single parents face because you live them every day." There it was, the acknowledgement that they knew more about him than a simple job referral should reveal. Mason set down the blueprints, his guard rising. "How exactly did you find me?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Mason to catch it. "Your name came highly recommended from someone in the community. Someone who was impressed by your character and work ethic. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either." Mason had been around enough job sites to recognize when someone was being careful with their words. "I'd like to know who recommended me." "I'm afraid. They asked to remain anonymous, but I can tell you that their assessment of your qualifications was glowing." Mason wanted to push harder, but the plans in front of him represented something he'd dreamed about since Emma was born. Meaningful work that could help families like his own. The paycheck Margaret had mentioned was fair, more than fair actually, and the timeline would give him steady income through the end of the year. "What's the consulting role specifically?" "Project oversight, quality control, liaison with subcontractors. You'd essentially be our eyes and ears on site, making sure the work gets done to spec and on schedule." Margaret pulled out a contract, a folder. "The position comes with a health insurance package, by the way. Full family coverage." Mason's heart stopped. Health insurance. Emma's medical bills had been manageable recently thanks to his mysterious benefactor, but having insurance would change everything. It would mean he could take her to specialists without calculating the cost first, could say yes to treatments instead of weighing them against rent money. "I need to think about it." "Of course, take all the time you need." But as Mason rode the elevator down from the 15th floor, he was already thinking about how to arrange childcare during site visits, already mentally organizing the project timeline. The job felt too good to be true, but maybe that was exactly what it was. Just good, without any hidden agenda. 3 blocks away, Sierra sat in her car in the foundation's parking garage, watching Mason's truck pull out onto the street. She'd been there for an hour, telling herself she just wanted to make sure the meeting went well, that her investment in the Helping Hands Foundation was being properly managed. The truth was more complicated. She wanted to see him again, to watch his face when he saw the project plans, to know if he'd recognize the opportunity she was offering him. Margaret had done her job perfectly, presenting the position exactly as Sierra had instructed. Generous but not suspicious, meaningful but not obviously personal. Sierra's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. He seemed interested but cautious. "Wants time to think it over." Of course he was cautious. Mason Hale didn't seem like the type of man who accepted gifts without question, even when they were disguised as job opportunities. Sierra respected that about him, even as it complicated her plans. She'd created the Helping Hands Foundation. 3 days after sending him the money, working through lawyers and accountants to establish something that looked legitimate because it was legitimate. The community center project was real, the need was real, and Mason's qualifications were exactly what the job required. The fact that it also gave her a reason to spend time with him was just a fortunate coincidence. That evening, Mason sat at his kitchen table with Emma on his lap, both of them looking at the contract Margaret had given him. Emma couldn't read, obviously, but she seemed to sense the importance of the papers, reaching for them with sticky fingers while Mason held them just out of reach. "What do you think, sweetheart? Should Daddy take the job?" Emma babbled something that sounded like approval and clapped her hands. Mason took that as a yes. The health insurance alone was worth more than his pride. And if his mysterious benefactor and this job opportunity were connected, which his gut told him they were, maybe. It was time to stop running from help and start accepting it gracefully. He pulled out his phone and dialed the foundation's number. "Margaret, it's Mason Hale. I'd like to accept the position." "Wonderful. Can you start Monday?" "I'll be there." After hanging up, Mason looked around his apartment. Still shabby, still small, but no longer quite so precarious. Emma was healthy. His bills were current, and he had meaningful work ahead of him. Maybe his luck really was changing. He just hoped he could handle whatever came next. Mason's first week at the community center site had been productive but solitary, inspecting electrical systems, meeting with subcontractors, taking detailed notes for Margaret's weekly reports. He was beginning to think the job was exactly what it appeared to be when Sierra Wrenfield walked through the front door on a Thursday morning, wearing jeans and work boots that looked like they'd never seen actual work. "You must be Mason," she said, extending a hand that was softer than any contractor's he'd ever shaken. "I'm Sierra. Margaret asked me to stop by and see how things are progressing." Mason wiped his dusty palm on his shirt before accepting her handshake, trying to place her face. Something familiar about the eyes, the way she carried herself. "Are you with the foundation?" "In a way. I represent some of the donors." Sierra looked around the gutted main hall, taking in the exposed beams and piles of debris with what appeared to be genuine interest. "This is going to be beautiful when it's finished." "It has good bones," Mason agreed, falling into step beside her as she moved toward the planned childcare area. "The previous owners did quality work. Most of what we're doing is updating systems and opening up the space." Sierra paused in the doorway of what would become the toddler room, and Mason caught something in her expression, a softness that seemed out of place on someone who spoke like boardrooms and quarterly reports. "This room will serve children Emma's age." Mason's hands stilled on his clipboard. He hadn't mentioned Emma to anyone at the foundation except Margaret, and only in passing. "How do you know about my daughter?" "Margaret mentioned you're a single father. It's part of why you were selected for this position." Sierra's voice was careful, professional. "The foundation believes that people who understand the challenges firsthand make the best advocates." It was a reasonable explanation, but Mason's instincts were humming with warning signals. "What kind of donors are we talking about? Corporate sponsors, private individuals? Does it matter?" It might. Donors usually want recognition, naming rights, photo opportunities. I should know what to expect. Sierra walked to the window overlooking what would be the playground, her back to Mason. "These particular donors value privacy. They're not interested in recognition." "Anonymous donors," Mason said slowly, "like the person who's been helping my family." Sierra turned around, and for a moment Mason saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. I wouldn't know anything about that, but she did know. Mason was certain of it. The way she'd paused when he mentioned Emma, the careful phrasing of her answers, The expensive clothes that didn't match her claimed role as a donor representative. Everything about this woman screamed money, real money, the kind that could pay off someone's debts without thinking twice. Sierra is fine. Sierra, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Are you the person who's been helping my family? Sierra held his gaze for a long moment, and Mason thought she might actually tell him the truth. Then her phone rang, and the moment passed. I'm sorry. I need to take this, she said, stepping into the next room. Mason couldn't hear the conversation, but he caught fragments through the open doorway, something about quarterly projections and board meetings. When Sierra returned, her professional mask was firmly back in place. I should let you get back to work, she said. But before I go, would it be possible for me to meet Emma sometime? The foundation likes to document how our projects impact the families they're designed to serve. Mason hesitated. His daughter was the most precious thing in his world, and his protective instincts were in overdrive around this woman who seemed to know too much about their lives. But Emma was also his weakness. One smile from her, and even the most guarded people found themselves volunteering for story time. She comes with me to the site sometimes when daycare is closed. Maybe next week. I'd like that. Sierra's smile seemed genuine this time, warmer than her professional demeanor. I'll check with Margaret about scheduling. After Sierra left, Mason stood in the empty building trying to piece together what he'd learned. She represented donors but wouldn't name them. She knew about Emma, but claimed Margaret had mentioned her. She dressed like money, but played coy about her actual role with the foundation. Most telling of all, she'd neither confirmed nor denied being his anonymous benefactor when he'd asked directly. The following Tuesday, Emma charmed her way through Mason's inspection of the kitchen renovation, babbling at the workers and clapping whenever someone used a power tool. She was having such a good time that Mason almost forgot Sierra was supposed to visit until he heard Emma squeal with delight behind him. He turned to find his daughter being gently lifted into the air by Sierra, who was making silly faces that sent Emma into peals of laughter. The transformation was startling. Gone was the composed businesswoman, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely enchanted by a toddler's attention. She's beautiful, Sierra said, settling Emma on her hip with natural ease. How old is she? 18 months, and she's never met a stranger. Mason watched carefully as Sierra interacted with his daughter, looking for signs of discomfort or pretense. Instead, he saw something that looked like longing. Does she like books? Loves them. We read together every night. Sierra reached into her purse and pulled out a small board book, something about farm animals that Emma immediately tried to eat. I thought she might enjoy this. It was a simple gesture, the kind any adult might make when meeting a child. But Mason noticed the book was expensive, the kind sold in upscale toy stores rather than grocery checkout lines. Another small extravagance from someone who claimed to be just a donor representative. You don't have to buy her things, Mason said quietly. I wanted to. She seems like a special little girl. Emma had discovered that Sierra's hair was long enough to grab and was now contentedly pulling on it while babbling a stream of nonsense. Sierra didn't seem to mind, even when tiny fingers got tangled in the strands. You're good with her, Mason observed. I don't have much experience with children, but she's easy to love. There was something wistful in Sierra's voice that made Mason look at her more closely. No kids of your own? No. No family to speak of, really. Sierra gently extracted her hair from Emma's grip. It's just me. The admission seemed to surprise Sierra herself, as if she hadn't meant to reveal something so personal. Mason found himself softening toward her, despite his suspicions. Money or no money, mysterious motives or not, she was just a person who seemed genuinely lonely. Would you like to see the rest of the renovation? He offered. For the next hour, Mason showed Sierra through the building, explaining the planned improvements and timeline for completion. She asked intelligent questions about accessibility features and safety protocols, demonstrating an understanding of construction details that seemed unusual for someone whose role was supposedly financial. Emma fell asleep in Sierra's arms somewhere, between the new HVAC system and the playground equipment discussion, and Sierra made no move to hand her back. She seemed content to carry the sleeping child, occasionally smoothing down her dark curls with gentle fingers. "She trusts you," Mason said as they concluded the tour. "Children are good judges of character. So are their fathers." Sierra met his eyes, and Mason saw a flicker of something vulnerable there. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm starting to trust you too, even though I probably shouldn't." "Why shouldn't you?" Mason gestured around the renovated space, then at his designer-clothed daughter's new friend. "Because none of this makes sense. The timing, the generosity, the way you showed up right when my family needed help. Either I'm the luckiest man alive, or someone's orchestrating all of this. Would that be so terrible? Depends on why they're doing it." Sierra carefully transferred the sleeping Emma back to Mason's arms, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. "Maybe some people just want to help. Maybe they see something worth investing in. Or maybe they want something in return. Not everything is a transaction, Mason. In my experience, everything is." Sierra picked up her purse, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Then maybe it's time you had a different kind of experience." After she left, Mason stood in the community center with his sleeping daughter, wondering what kind of game he'd gotten himself into. Because whatever Sierra's real story was, whatever she wanted from him, he was beginning to care more about her answer than was probably wise, and that scared him more than any debt collector ever had. Sierra started visiting the construction site every few days, always with a plausible reason, checking on progress, meeting with subcontractors, reviewing budget allocations. Mason began to anticipate her arrivals, finding himself listening for the sound of her car in the parking lot, looking up whenever footsteps echoed in the main hall. Today, she'd brought coffee and pastries from an expensive downtown bakery, claiming the foundation wanted to show appreciation for the workers. But Mason noticed she stayed long after the crew had finished their break, helping him organize project files in what would eventually become the administrative office. "You don't have to do this," Mason said, watching her sort invoices with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to paperwork. "I'm sure you have other places to be." Sierra looked up from the stack of electrical permits. "Actually, I don't. This is the most productive I've felt in months." "What do you normally do?" "For work, I mean. I run a company, media consulting, acquisitions, that sort of thing." Sierra's voice was carefully neutral. "It's not very hands-on." Mason filed that information away with everything else he'd learned about her. She drove a car that cost more than most people's houses, but knew the difference between load-bearing and decorative beams. She claimed to represent donors, but spoke about money like someone who'd never had to budget for groceries. She was comfortable in boardrooms, but seemed more relaxed sitting on construction site sawhorses, sorting paperwork in jeans and work boots. "Is that fulfilling? The media consulting?" Sierra paused in her sorting, considering the question. "It pays well. It's what I'm good at, but fulfilling?" She gestured around the half-renovated space. "This feels more meaningful than anything I've done in years." "Why?" "Because it's going to help real people. Families like yours." Sierra's voice grew softer. "I didn't grow up with much stability. My parents were complicated. Money can't buy you the kind of childhood you're giving Emma, but it can create spaces where that happens for other families." It was the most personal thing she'd shared, and Mason found himself wanting to know more. What kind of complicated? The kind where love was conditional on performance, where affection was earned through achievements and withdrawn as punishment. Sierra set down the invoices, her composure cracking slightly. "I learned early that relationships were transactions. You give something, you get something. Balance the books." Mason thought about his own childhood in foster care, the string of families who'd seen him as a monthly stipend rather than a child. "That's a lonely way to grow up." Very lonely, but safe in its way. If you know the rules, you can play the game. What happens when someone changes the rules? Sierra looked at him directly, and Mason saw something raw in her expression. You panic. You try to figure out what they want so you can give it to them before they leave. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Mason wasn't sure he was ready to cross. This wasn't the polished businesswoman who'd first walked into his construction site. This was someone admitting to the same fears that kept him awake at night, the terror of being abandoned, of not being enough, of watching the people you cared about walk away. For what it's worth, Mason said carefully, some people don't keep score. Everyone keeps score, Mason. Some people are just better at hiding it. Before Mason could respond, his phone rang, the pediatrician's office, calling about Emma's upcoming appointment. He stepped away to take the call, but when he returned, Sierra was studying a framed photo he kept on his makeshift desk. Emma on her first birthday, chocolate cake smeared across her face, grinning with pure joy. She looks just like you, Sierra said. Thank God. I was worried she'd inherited her mother's talent for disappearing when things got difficult. Her mother left? Mason hadn't meant to say that, but something about Sierra's earlier honesty made him want to reciprocate. When Emma was 6 months old, Sarah couldn't handle the diagnosis, the medical appointments, the uncertainty. She said she didn't sign up for a sick child. I'm sorry. Don't be. Emma's better off without someone who saw her as defective. Mason picked up the photo, running his thumb over the glass. But it's been hard, trying to be everything she needs. You're doing an incredible job. Am I? Most days I feel like I'm failing her, like she deserves more than a father who counts pennies for medicine and lives paycheck to paycheck. Sierra was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She deserves a father who loves her unconditionally. Everything else is just logistics. Mason looked up to find Sierra watching him with an intensity that made his chest tight. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite read, longing maybe or recognition, like she was seeing something she'd always wanted but never thought she could have. Sierra. His phone rang again, this time with a number he didn't recognize. Mason almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Mr. Hale. This is Dr. Martinez's office. We need to reschedule Emma's appointment for tomorrow. The doctor has had an emergency. Mason's heart sank. Emma's appointments were scheduled months in advance, and rescheduling meant waiting another 6 weeks for an opening. When's the next available slot? I have an opening in late November. That's 2 months. Wait, she needs to be seen sooner than that. I understand, Mr. Hale, but what about Dr. Chen's practice or the clinic on 5th Street? I can give you their numbers, but I should warn you that most pediatric specialists in the city have similar wait times. After hanging up, Mason slumped against the wall, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness settle over him. Emma needed regular monitoring for her respiratory condition, needed adjustments to her medication based on her growth and development. 2 months was too long to wait. What's wrong? Sierra asked. Mason explained the situation, watching Sierra's expression grow more troubled with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking, what if I made some calls? She offered finally. The foundation has relationships with several medical facilities. We might be able to expedite an appointment. You'd do that? Of course. Emma's health is the priority. Mason wanted to say yes immediately, but his pride held him back. He'd already accepted too much help from mysterious sources, had already compromised his independence in ways that made him uncomfortable. But looking at the photo of Emma in his hands, he realized his pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. If you could make those calls, I'd be grateful. Sierra pulled out her phone and walked to the other side of the room, speaking in low tones to someone who clearly took her requests seriously. Mason couldn't hear the details, but her tone suggested this wasn't the first time she'd called in favors for medical appointments. Dr. Patel can see Emma tomorrow afternoon, Sierra announced when she returned. He's considered one of the best pediatric pulmonologists in the state. How did you... The foundation has made significant donations to Children's Hospital. They were happy to accommodate a request. It was another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. The Helping Hands Foundation was supposedly new, but Sierra spoke about it like an established entity with serious political capital. And the ease with which she'd arranged the appointment suggested influence that went far beyond donor representation. "Thank you," Mason said, meaning it despite his growing suspicions. "This means everything." "Emma means everything," Sierra corrected. "The rest is just phone calls." As they packed up the office for the day, Mason found himself watching Sierra more carefully. The way she moved through the space like she owned it. The unconscious authority in her voice when she spoke to contractors. The expensive watch she tried to hide under long sleeves. Everything about her suggested money and power, but she used both in service of other people's needs. She could have written a check and walked away, could have made her donations anonymously, and never gotten involved in the messy reality of construction timelines and permit delays. Instead, she was here, sorting invoices and making medical appointments and looking at his daughter like she was something precious and rare. Mason didn't know what to make of Sierra Wrenfield, but he was beginning to suspect that whatever game she was playing, he was already losing. The question was whether losing to her might be the best thing that had ever happened to him. The appointment with Dr. Patel had gone better than Mason could have hoped. Emma's condition was stable, her medication was properly calibrated, and the doctor had been impressed with the quality of care she'd been receiving. But as Mason sat in the hospital parking lot afterward, buckling Emma into her car seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was spinning beyond his control. The appointment had been scheduled with impossible speed. The specialist had waived his usual consultation fee. The hospital staff had treated them like VIPs, offering amenities that Mason was certain weren't standard for families with his insurance coverage. Someone with serious influence had made phone calls on his behalf. Someone who could cut through bureaucratic red tape with a few words and open doors that normally stayed locked for people in his situation. Someone like Sierra Wrenfield. That evening, Mason sat at his kitchen table with Emma on his lap, both of them looking through the children's book Sierra had given her. Emma babbled along with the story, turning pages with the intense concentration that made everything an adventure in her 18-month-old world. His phone rang, and Sierra's name appeared on the screen. They'd been texting regularly about the construction project, but this was the first time she'd called him directly. "How did the appointment go?" she asked without preamble. "Good. Great, actually." Dr. Patel was thorough, and Emma charmed her way through the entire examination. Mason paused, choosing his words carefully. He mentioned that someone from the foundation had called ahead to brief him on Emma's case history. "Margaret handles most of our medical outreach. She's very thorough." Another careful non-answer. Mason was beginning to catalogue Sierra's evasions, the subtle ways she redirected conversations when they ventured too close to her actual role in his life. "Sierra, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "The foundation. How long have you been involved with it?" A pause. "Why do you ask?" "Because Emma's medical file is confidential. Nobody should have access to her case history without my written consent." But Dr. Patel knew details about her condition that weren't in any referral paperwork. Silence stretched between them, and Mason could almost hear Sierra calculating her response. "The foundation has relationships with several medical providers," she said finally. "Sometimes information gets shared in the interest of providing better care. That's not how patient privacy laws work. Mason, does it matter how the appointment was arranged?" "Emma got the care she needed." "It matters because someone accessed my daughter's medical records without permission." "It matters because I'm starting to feel like a charity case being managed by people I don't know, for reasons I don't understand." "You're not a charity case." "Then what am I?" Another pause, longer this time. "You're a good father trying to do right by his daughter, that's all." But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. Mason could hear something in Sierra's voice, frustration maybe, or fear, like she wanted to tell him the truth but couldn't find the words. "Sierra, are you the person who's been helping my family?" "I need to go," she said abruptly. "I'll see you at the site tomorrow." The line went dead, leaving Mason staring at his phone and feeling more confused than ever. The next morning, Sierra didn't come to the construction site, or the day after that. Margaret called to say that Sierra was handling some urgent business matters and wouldn't be available for site visits for the rest of the week. Mason found himself missing her presence more than was probably wise. He'd grown accustomed to her. Questions about the renovation, her genuine interest in the project details, the way she looked at Emma like she was something miraculous. The site felt emptier without her, more like just another job instead of something meaningful. By Friday, his curiosity got the better of him. During his lunch break, Mason did something he probably shouldn't have. He Googled Sierra Wrenfield. The search results filled his phone screen with headlines and photographs that made his coffee grow cold in his hands. Media mogul Sierra Wrenfield announces Q3 acquisition. Wrenfield Industries expands digital portfolio. Billionaire heiress donates $50 million to children's charities. Mason clicked through article after article, each one revealing more about the woman who'd been sorting his invoices and buying his daughter picture books. Sierra Wrenfield wasn't just wealthy, she was one of the richest people in the country. Her company owned television networks, publishing houses, and digital media platforms that reached millions of people daily. The photographs showed her in boardrooms and at charity galas, always perfectly composed, always surrounded by people who looked like they calculated the cost of everything, including their smiles. She looked beautiful and untouchable, like someone who lived in a different universe from single fathers who counted pennies for medicine. Mason scrolled through image after image, looking for some sign of the woman who'd carried his sleeping daughter around a construction site, who'd shared stories about her lonely childhood, who'd looked at him like he was more than just another project to manage. One article from 6 months ago caught his attention. Wrenfield creates Anonymous, foundation to support single-parent families. The piece was brief, mentioning Sierra's commitment to helping families in crisis while maintaining the privacy of both donors and recipients. The Helping Hands Foundation wasn't just funded by Sierra Wrenfield, it was hers entirely, which meant every conversation they'd had, every moment of seeming honesty and connection, had been built on a foundation of lies. Mason set down his phone, feeling like someone had pulled the ground out from under him. Sierra hadn't been representing donors. She was the donor. She hadn't stumbled into his life by coincidence. She'd orchestrated every interaction, from the anonymous payments to the job opportunity to the medical appointments. He thought about the way she'd looked at Emma, the genuine affection that had seemed to surprise her. Had that been real, or just another performance from someone who'd learned to play emotional games for strategic advantage? His phone buzzed with a text from Sierra. "Can we talk? I'll be at the site this afternoon." Mason stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'll be here." Sierra arrived at 4 o'clock, looking nervous in a way he'd never seen before. She was wearing jeans and work boots again, but now Mason could see the expensive cut of the fabric, the designer labels she'd tried to hide. Everything about her screamed money and power, and he couldn't believe he'd missed it. "You Googled me," she said without preamble. "Was I not supposed to?" "I was hoping to tell you myself." "When?" "After another month of pretending to be a donor. Representative. After another round of mysterious payments and convenient coincidences." Sierra flinched, like he'd slapped her. "It's not what you think. What I think is that you've been playing games with my family's life. What I think is that everything between us has been a lie." "Not everything." Sierra's voice was barely above a whisper. "The way I feel about you, about Emma, that's real. How would I know? You've lied about everything else." Mason turned away. "If from her, focusing on the renovation plans spread across his makeshift desk. He couldn't look at her face, couldn't risk letting her see how much her deception had hurt him. "Mason, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "How a billionaire decided to make a pet project out of a struggling single father. How you've been manipulating every aspect of my life for your own entertainment. It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Mason finally looked at her and was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you saw someone desperate enough to accept help without asking too many questions." "I saw someone who reminded me that good people still exist," Sierra said fiercely. "I saw a man who helped a stranger having a panic attack without thinking about what he might get in return. I saw a father who would do anything for his child, who puts her needs above his own pride every single day." "So you decided to what? Study me? See how the other half lives?" "I decided to help you because you deserved it. Because Emma deserved it. Because for the first time in my adult life, I met someone who wasn't trying to get something from me. Mason wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to his righteous indignation and wounded pride, but looking at Sierra's face, seeing the raw vulnerability there, he felt his resolve wavering. "Why didn't you just tell me who you were?" "Because I was afraid you'd look at me differently. Because I was afraid you'd see the money instead of me." Sierra wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because I've never had someone care about me for who I am instead of what I can do for them. And you thought lying about your identity was the solution. I thought if I could just be Sierra for a while, not Sierra Wrenfield, the media mogul, maybe I could figure out who I really am underneath. All the business suits and board meetings." Mason studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. Instead, he saw someone who looked as lost and scared as he felt. The foundation, the job, the medical appointments. All of it was you. Yes, and you've been watching. Me orchestrating my life, deciding what I need. I've been trying to help you, without asking if I wanted help, without giving me a choice in any of it. Sierra was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. I'm sorry." "Are you? Or are you just sorry I found out? I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry I made decisions about your life without consulting you. I'm sorry I've been so afraid of rejection that I manipulated the situation instead of being honest." Sierra took a shaky breath. "But I'm not sorry I helped you, and I'm not sorry I got to know you and Emma." Mason felt something inside him crack open, all the anger and hurt mixing with feelings he wasn't ready to name. Because despite everything, despite the lies and manipulation and wounded pride, he wasn't sorry either. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know. That's up to you." Mason looked around the construction site that had brought them together at the community center that would help families like his own, at the future Sierra's money had made possible. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need." Sierra gathered her purse and headed for the door, but stopped before leaving. "Mason, the way I feel about you, that was never a lie. And if I've ruined any chance we might have had, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." After she left, Mason stood alone in the half-renovated space, surrounded by the evidence of Sierra's generosity and deception. He was angry and grateful, and confused, and maybe a little bit in love with someone who'd just blown up every assumption he'd made about his life. The question was whether he was brave enough to find out what came next. Mason spent the weekend avoiding his phone and Emma's questions about where Sierra had gone. His daughter had grown attached to the woman who brought her books and made funny faces, and explaining why she wouldn't be coming around anymore felt impossible when Mason couldn't even explain it to himself. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mason was reviewing electrical specs when a man in an expensive suit walked into the construction site, looking like he'd never set foot on anything less polished than marble floors. "Mr. Hale, I'm David Chen, Sierra Wrenfield's attorney. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Mason's stomach dropped. "If this is about a lawsuit, nothing like that. Ms. Wrenfield asked me to deliver something to you." David pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase. She wanted you to have all the information before making any decisions about your future with the foundation. Inside the envelope was a folder marked confidential and a handwritten letter from Sierra. Mason opened the letter first, recognizing her neat handwriting from project notes she'd left around the site. Mason, I know you asked for time to think, but I realized I haven't given you all the information you need to make an informed decision. The attached documents contain everything about the foundation, about my involvement in your life, and about some things I should have told you from the beginning. I hope when you've read everything, you'll understand why I made the choices I did. Whatever you decide, Emma will always be taken care of. That was never conditional on anything between us. Sierra. The folder contained bank statements, legal documents, and what appeared to be a private investigator's report with Mason's name on it. His hands shook as he opened to the first page, seeing his own life laid out in clinical detail. Employment, history, medical bills, Emma's condition, Sarah's abandonment. Everything Sierra had known about him before their first accidental meeting. But it was the final document that made Mason's world tilt on its axis. It was a medical report dated 3 weeks before the airport incident, bearing the letterhead of one of the city's most prestigious hospitals. The patient name at the top read Sierra Wrenfield. The diagnosis section contained words that made Mason's chest tight. Severe anxiety disorder, panic disorder with agoraphobia, recommended immediate psychiatric intervention. Mason read the report twice, his understanding of everything shifting with each paragraph. Sierra hadn't been having a random panic attack at the airport. She'd been in the middle of a mental health crisis that had been building for months. The report detailed her increasing isolation, her inability to attend public events, her fear of crowds and enclosed spaces. She almost didn't make that flight, David said quietly. She'd been trying to travel for business for weeks, but kept having attacks every time she got to the airport. The day you met her was her 4th attempt to board a plane in 2 months. Why are you telling me this? Because she's afraid you'll think her interest in you was calculated from the beginning. She wants you to know that when you helped her, that day, she wasn't thinking strategically about anything. She was just grateful that someone saw her as a person instead of a problem to be managed. Mason stared at the medical report, remembering Sierra crumpled on the airport floor, the terror in her eyes, the way she'd clung to his hand like it was the only solid thing in her world. He'd thought she was just having a bad day. He hadn't. Realized he'd been talking someone through a crisis that had been months in the making. The investigation into your background, David continued, didn't start until a week later, after she realized she couldn't stop thinking about the man who'd helped her without expecting anything in return. Mason flipped through more documents, emails, between Sierra and Margaret about establishing the foundation, architectural plans for the community center, medical consultation reports about Emma's condition. The timeline painted a picture of someone who'd started with genuine gratitude and gradually become invested in his family's well-being. She could have just sent money, Mason said finally. She did send money, but then she wanted to know if it had helped, and then she wanted to know if there was more she could do. And before long, she was designing an entire project around the idea of creating something that would benefit your family and others like yours, by lying about who she was, by trying to be someone she thought you could care about. David's voice was gentle but firm. Miss Wrenfield has been manipulated by people who wanted her money her entire life. She's never had a relationship that wasn't transactional. When she met you, she panicked and handled it badly, but her intentions were never dishonest. Mason thought about Sierra's stories of her childhood, the careful way she talked about relationships as transactions, the longing in her voice when she described his unconditional love for Emma. He'd been so focused on her deception that he'd missed the deeper truth. She'd been trying to learn how to have something real with someone, and she'd been terrified he'd reject her if he knew who she really was. There's something else, David said, pulling out another document. This is the Foundation's operating agreement. Ms. Wrenfield has named you as co-director, with full decision-making authority over all projects. Your salary would be commensurate with executive positions at similar organizations. Mason looked at the salary figure and nearly dropped the papers. It was more money than he'd made in the past 3 years combined. She's offering me a job. She's offering you a partnership. The Foundation was always intended to be about helping single-parent families, but she realizes now that it needs someone who actually understands those challenges, someone who can ensure the resources go where they're needed most. And if I say no, then you say no. The Foundation continues without you. Your consulting contract is honored through completion of this project, and Emma's medical trust fund remains in place regardless. Medical trust fund. David smiled slightly. Ms. Wrenfield established an educational and medical trust for Emma the day after she learned about her condition. It will cover all medical expenses through college and includes provisions for any future children you might have. Mason felt like he was drowning in Sierra's generosity and his own confused emotions. Why would she do all this? Because she loves you, David said simply. Both of you. And because she's learned that love isn't a transaction. It's a gift you give without expecting anything back. After David left, Mason sat alone in the construction site, surrounded by the evidence of Sierra's lies and her love, trying to make sense of feelings that seemed too big for his chest. She'd manipulated him, yes, but she'd also saved him. She'd lied about her identity, but she'd been honest about everything else that mattered. His phone rang. Margaret from the Foundation. Mason, I wanted to let you know that Sierra has stepped back from all Foundation activities. She felt it was important that you have space to make decisions without feeling pressured. What does that mean? It means the Foundation continues its work, but she won't be involved in day-to-day operations. She wanted you to know that your job security isn't dependent on your personal relationship with her. Margaret, can I ask you something? How long have you known who she really is? A pause. Since the beginning. I've worked for Sierra for 8 years, across several of her companies. When she told me she wanted to create something that would help single parents, I thought it was just another tax write-off project. But watching her with you and Emma, I've never seen her care about anything the way she cares about your family. After hanging up, Mason walked through the community center, seeing it with new eyes. Every renovation decision had been made with families like his in mind. The childcare area was designed for children with special needs. The medical consultation room was equipped for telehealth appointments. The food pantry was stocked with items specifically chosen for families dealing with chronic conditions. Sierra hadn't just thrown money at a problem, she'd educated herself about the real challenges single parents faced and designed solutions accordingly. She'd taken her privilege and used it to create something genuinely helpful, something that would outlast whatever happened between them personally. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Hale, this is Patricia, Ms. Wrenfield's assistant. She asked me to tell you that she's checking into a private facility for treatment of her anxiety disorder. She wanted you to know so you wouldn't worry if you don't hear from her for a while. She also wanted me to tell you that loving you and Emma has been the realest thing in her life, and she hopes someday you'll be able to forgive her for handling it so badly. Mason stared at the message, feeling his anger crumble completely. Sierra wasn't hiding from the consequences of her actions. She was getting help for the problems that had caused them. She was taking responsibility not just for lying to him, but for the deeper issues that had made her afraid to be honest in the first place. Emma's daycare was closing in an hour. Mason needed to pick up his daughter, needed to figure out how to explain Sierra's absence without breaking a toddler's heart. But first, he needed to make a decision about what kind of man he wanted to be. The kind who held on to pride and resentment, who let fear keep him from taking chances on people who might hurt him, or the kind who understood that love was messy and complicated that good people sometimes made bad choices, and that forgiveness was often the bravest thing you could do. Mason pulled out his phone and typed a message to Patricia. "Please tell Sierra that I'd like to talk when she's ready, and tell her that Emma misses her." After sending the text, he looked around the community center one more time. Tomorrow, he would call David Chen and accept the co-director position, not because he was in love with a billionaire, but because the work mattered, because families like his needed advocates who understood their struggles from the inside, and because Sierra Wrenfield had been right about one thing. Sometimes people deserved second chances, even when they didn't know how to ask for them. 3 weeks passed without word from Sierra. Mason threw himself into finishing the community center, working longer hours than necessary and accepting the co-director position with a determination that surprised Margaret. The project was scheduled to open in 2 weeks, and despite everything that had happened, Mason was proud of what they'd accomplished. The building had been transformed from a hollow shell into something vibrant and welcoming. The main hall gleamed with new floors and fresh paint. The childcare areas were equipped with everything a working parent could need, and the medical consultation room was ready to serve families who couldn't afford private health care. Emma had adapted to Sierra's absence with the resilience of childhood, though she still looked toward the door, expectantly, whenever they visited the site. Mason had told her that Sierra was sick and needed to get better, which was true enough for an 18-month-old to understand. The truth was, Mason missed Sierra more than he'd expected. Not just the romantic possibility they'd been dancing around, but her genuine enthusiasm for the project, her thoughtful questions about design choices, the way she'd looked at their work like it mattered beyond the financial investment. Patricia called every few days with updates. Sierra was responding well to treatment, working with therapists to address the anxiety and control issues that had shaped her approach to relationships. She was learning to sit with uncertainty, to build trust gradually instead of trying to orchestrate outcomes. "She asks about you," Patricia had said during their last conversation. "About you and Emma, but she's committed to finishing the program before reaching out directly." How much longer? 2 more weeks, possibly 3. The doctors want to make sure she has the tools to handle stress differently before she returns to her regular life. Mason had been counting days since that conversation, telling himself it was just curiosity while knowing it was something much deeper. The community center's grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday morning, complete with local officials, foundation board members, and families from the neighborhood. Mason had spent the week coordinating with vendors, reviewing security protocols, and trying not to think about the fact that Sierra wouldn't be there to see their project come to life. Friday evening, as Mason was doing a final walkthrough of the facility, Margaret approached him with a manila envelope. "This came by courier an hour ago," she said. "No return address, but I recognize the handwriting." Inside was a single sheet of paper, a child's drawing in crayon, clearly created by someone much older than its intended subject. It showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a building that was unmistakably the community center. The tallest figure wore a hard hat and held the hand of the smallest figure, who clutched what appeared to be a book. The third figure stood slightly apart, but connected to the others by a rainbow that arced over all their heads. At the bottom, in Sierra's careful handwriting, Emma's first day at the new center, as imagined by someone who wishes she could be there to see it. "Congratulations on creating something beautiful, S." Mason stared at the drawing for a long time, seeing not just the simple images, but the longing behind them. Sierra had drawn herself into their lives, connected but separate, part of their story, but uncertain of her welcome. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Ms. Wrenfield wanted you to know that she's being discharged tomorrow morning. She didn't want you to be surprised if you see news coverage of her return to public life." Mason realized he was holding his breath. Tomorrow, Sierra would be free to contact him directly, to attend the opening if she chose, to reclaim her place in the Foundation's work. The question was whether she would, and whether he was ready if she did. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for an outdoor ribbon-cutting ceremony. Mason arrived early to oversee final preparations, Emma in tow, because daycare was closed for the weekend. She wore a new dress for the occasion, yellow with small flowers, purchased with money that no longer came with strings attached. The crowd began gathering at 9 o'clock. Local families with children, city council members, reporters from 2 newspapers, and several prominent philanthropists who'd heard about the project through foundation channels. Mason mingled with the guests, explaining the center's programs, and trying to ignore his frequent glances toward the parking lot. At 10:30, Margaret stepped to the microphone for opening remarks. She spoke about the foundation's mission, about the families the center would serve, about the vision of creating supportive communities for single parents. Her words were eloquent and heartfelt, but Mason found himself only half listening, still, scanning the crowd for a face he wasn't sure would appear. "And now," Margaret concluded, "I'd like to introduce our co-director, Mason Hale, who has brought both professional expertise and personal understanding to this project." Mason took the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, others curious strangers who'd come to see what their tax dollars and charitable donations had built. Emma sat in the front row with one of the daycare volunteers, clapping enthusiastically even though she didn't understand what was happening. "6 months ago," Mason began, "I was a single father wondering how I was going to pay my daughters' medical bills. I was working construction jobs that barely covered rent, and I felt like I was failing at the most important job I'd ever had, being Emma's dad." He paused, gathering his thoughts and his courage. "This community center exists because someone believed that struggling doesn't mean you're not worthy of help. Someone understood that families like mine need more than charity. We need opportunity, support, and the chance to build something better for our children." Mason looked down at Emma, who was now standing on her chair and waving at him with both hands. The sight of her bright smile gave him the strength to continue. "The woman who made this possible taught me that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a recognition that we're all connected, that your success and happiness matter to people you might never meet. She also taught me that trust is earned through actions, not words, and that sometimes the most generous thing you can do is believe in someone's potential, even when they can't see it themselves." As Mason spoke, he noticed a commotion at the back of the crowd. Someone was making their way through the gathered families, moving carefully to avoid disrupting the ceremony. His heart started beating faster before his mind consciously recognized who it was. Sierra appeared at the edge of the crowd, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, looking nervous and hopeful and more beautiful than Mason remembered. She caught his eye across the distance and offered a small, tentative smile. Mason's prepared speech evaporated from his mind. All the careful words he'd planned about community support and foundation partnerships suddenly seemed less important than the woman who was watching him with tears in her eyes. "The truth is," Mason said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "this center was built by someone who understands that love isn't about controlling outcomes or managing risks. It's about showing up for people, even when you're scared, even when you don't know how the story ends." He set down the microphone and stepped away from the podium, walking directly towards Sierra through the crowd. People moved aside, sensing that something important was happening, though most didn't understand what. Sierra met him halfway, stopping a few feet away as if unsure of her welcome. "I didn't know if I should come," she said quietly. Her words meant only for him. "I was hoping you would. I've been working on some things, about trust, about honesty, about not trying to control everything and everyone around me. How's that going?" Sierra's smile was shaky but genuine, terrifying, but worth it, I think. Emma had noticed Sierra's arrival and was now running toward them, her yellow dress streaming behind her like sunshine. Sierra knelt down to catch her, lifting the toddler into a hug that spoke of weeks of missing each other. "Cece," Emma announced to everyone within hearing distance, having never quite mastered Sierra's full name. "Hi, sweetheart," Sierra whispered, holding Emma tight. "I missed you so much." "Book," Emma demanded, apparently expecting Sierra to produce reading material from thin air as she always had before. "I have a book for you," Sierra said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. "But first, we need to see if your daddy will forgive me for being so scared and silly." Emma looked between them with the serious expression she wore when adults said things she didn't quite understand, but sensed were important. "Forgive Cece, Daddy," she instructed gravely, as if the matter was settled. Mason looked at Sierra, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd done the hard work of facing her fears, someone who'd chosen growth over comfort, someone who'd risked rejection by showing up when it mattered most. "There's nothing to forgive," he said, reaching out to take her free hand. "Only things to figure out together." Sierra's tears spilled over then, and Mason found himself holding both of the most important females in his life, surrounded by a crowd of strangers who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something more significant than a building dedication. "Does this mean Cece stays?" Emma asked, patting Sierra's face with sticky fingers. "If she wants to," Mason said, looking into Sierra's eyes. "If she's ready for a different kind of adventure." "I'm ready," Sierra said, "for whatever comes. Next, for building something real together without any scripts or safety nets." Margaret's voice came through the microphone behind them. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can safely say that this community center has already succeeded in its mission of bringing families together." The crowd laughed and applauded, but Mason barely heard them. He was too busy memorizing this moment, Sierra's face wet with tears and bright with hope, Emma babbling excitedly about books and Cece and the pretty building, the sun warm on. All their faces as they stood at the threshold of whatever came next. The ribbon-cutting ceremony could wait another few minutes. Some things were more important than schedules and official openings. Some things were worth celebrating exactly as they happened, messy and unscripted and perfect in their imperfection. The ribbon-cutting ceremony proceeded with a joy that felt almost electric. Sierra stood beside Mason as Margaret handed him the oversized scissors, Emma perched on Sierra's hip and chattering excitedly about the bright red ribbon stretched across. "The community center's entrance. Would you like to do the honors together?" Mason asked Sierra, offering her one handle of the scissors. "I think this moment belongs to you," Sierra replied, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears of gratitude. Mason cut the ribbon to enthusiastic applause, officially opening the Helping Hands Community Center. The crowd surged forward to tour the facility, families with children exploring the childcare areas, single parents examining the resource center, local officials praising the thoughtful design that addressed real community needs. But Mason found himself watching Sierra more than the celebration. She moved through the crowd with a grace he'd forgotten, but there was something different about her now, a quietness that seemed less controlled and more centered. She listened when people spoke to her, really listened, instead of calculating her responses. She accepted compliments about the project without deflecting them onto other people or minimizing her own contribution. When a local reporter approached for an interview, Sierra handled the questions with professional competence, but also with a warmth that felt genuine rather than performed. "Ms. Wrenfield, what inspired you to focus specifically on single-parent families?" "I learned recently that the best community solutions come from people who understand the challenges firsthand," Sierra said, glancing toward Mason. "My role was to provide resources. The real vision came from someone who lives these realities every day. And what's next for the foundation? We're planning 3 more centers in underserved areas, but the timeline will depend on finding the right community partners. This isn't about imposing solutions from the outside. It's about supporting initiatives that families identify as meaningful. Mason felt something shift in his chest, hearing Sierra speak about their work with such clarity and humility. This wasn't the polished businesswoman who'd first walked into his construction site. This was someone who'd learned to use her privilege in service of something larger than herself. Emma had fallen asleep in Sierra's arms during the interview, her small body relaxed in complete trust. Sierra held her carefully, unconsciously swaying slightly in the way that came naturally to people who understood how to comfort children. "She trusts you," Mason observed as the reporter moved away. "Children are honest about their feelings," Sierra replied, smoothing Emma's dark hair. "They don't overthink relationships the way adults do." "Is that what we've been doing? Overthinking?" Sierra met his eyes, and Mason saw vulnerability there that was different from the fear he'd recognized before. This felt more like hope tempered by hard-won wisdom. "I've been learning to think differently about a lot of things," she said carefully, "about control, about trust, about what it means to build something real with another person." Before Mason could respond, Margaret approached with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a scheduling conflict with the afternoon program. The children's reading group was supposed to use the main hall, but the city council members want to extend their tour. Can we move the reading group to tomorrow?" "Actually," Sierra said, "what if we do the reading group now? I happen to have a book with me." She pulled the wrapped package she'd brought for Emma from her purse, revealing a beautifully illustrated children's book about community gardens. Mason recognized it as another expensive edition, but this time Sierra's gift didn't feel calculated. It felt like someone sharing something she genuinely wanted to celebrate. Within minutes, a group of children had gathered in the new reading corner. Sierra sitting cross-legged on the carpet with Emma on her lap and a dozen other kids arranged in a circle around her. Mason watched from the doorway as Sierra read with animated voices and encouraged the children to point out details in the illustrations. "She's different," Margaret said quietly, joining Mason at the edge of the room. "How so?" "More present." Before her treatment, Sierra was always managing 10 things at once in her head. She'd be in a meeting, but thinking about the next meeting, talking to one person while calculating how to handle someone else. Now she seems here. Mason could see what Margaret meant. Sierra was fully engaged with the children, responding to their questions and comments without seeming distracted or impatient. When one little boy spilled juice on his shirt, she helped him clean it up without any visible concern for her own. "Expensive sweater. Daddy, look," Emma announced from Sierra's lap, holding up the book for Mason to see. "Garden." "That's right, sweetheart. A community garden, just like we might have here someday." "Can we plant flowers, Cece?" Emma asked, looking up at Sierra with the complete faith that adults could make anything happen. "If your daddy thinks it's a good idea, maybe we can," Sierra replied, looking at Mason with a question in her eyes. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Mason said, and meant it. After the reading group dispersed, Mason and Sierra found themselves alone in the main hall, while Emma played with blocks in the nearby childcare area. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the space they'd created together, the physical manifestation of what was possible when people combined resources, vision, and genuine care for others. "Can I ask you something?" Mason said. "Anything." "What changed? I mean, I can see that you're different, but what actually changed for you?" Sierra was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I learned that trying to control outcomes is usually about fear. Fear that people will leave, fear that I'm not enough on my own, fear that if I'm not useful, I'm not valuable. And now I'm working on believing that I'm worth caring about just as I am. Not because of what I can do for people, but because of who I am when I'm not trying to manage every variable." Mason studied her face, seeing the truth of those words in her expression. "That sounds like hard work, the hardest I've ever done. But also the most important." Sierra looked around the community center, then back at Mason. I realized that everything I built with you, the foundation, this project, our relationship, I built it on a foundation of fear and control, and I wanted to tear it down and build it again, the right way. What's the right way? Honestly, vulnerability, accepting that I can't guarantee outcomes, but I can choose to show up authentically and hope that's enough. Emma's voice carried across the room as she narrated an elaborate story involving her blocks. Something about castles and princesses and dragons who turned out to be friendly. Her imagination transformed the simple toys into an entire world of possibility. She has your gift for seeing potential in things, Sierra observed. Actually, I think she gets that from you, Mason replied. You saw potential in me when I couldn't see it myself. I saw someone who was already everything he needed to be. I just had the resources to help clear away some of the obstacles. Mason took a step closer to Sierra, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of her perfume. Sierra, what happens now? With us, I mean. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm hoping we can figure it out together. But I need you to know that I'm different now. Not perfect, not finished with my own work, but different in ways that matter. How do I know that? You don't. That's the thing about trust. It's a choice you make without guarantees. I'm asking you to choose to trust me again, knowing that I might still make mistakes, but also knowing that I'll never lie to you about who I am again. Mason reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin and the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. I've been thinking about something you said weeks ago, he told her, about how not everything is a transaction. I think I'm ready to find out what that looks like. Sierra's smile was radiant, transforming her face in a way that reminded Mason why he'd been drawn to her from the beginning. Not because of her money or her influence, but because of moments like this, when her guard came down and he could see the woman she was underneath all the armor she'd built. Daddy, see, look what I made! Emma's excited voice broke the spell, and they turned to see her proudly displaying a tower of blocks that defied several laws of physics. But it was standing, precarious and beautiful, and uniquely hers. That's amazing, sweetheart, Mason said, kneeling down to admire her architecture. It's like our family, Emma announced with the profound wisdom that sometimes emerged from toddlers. Different pieces, but they stick together. Mason and Sierra exchanged a look over Emma's head, both understanding that sometimes the most important truths came from the smallest voices. Maybe they were different pieces. Maybe their foundation had been shaky in the beginning. But they were still standing, still choosing to stick together despite the odds against them, and maybe that was enough to build something beautiful on. The community center had been open for 3 hours when Emma's breathing changed. Mason noticed it first, the slight wheeze that meant her airways were constricting, the way she rubbed at her chest with small fists. He'd learned to recognize the early signs of her respiratory episodes. The subtle shifts that meant they had minutes, not hours, to respond. Sierra, he said quietly, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. I need to get Emma to the hospital. Sierra looked down at Emma, who was still playing with her blocks, but breathing faster now, each exhale requiring more effort than it should. Without hesitation, Sierra scooped up the little girl, her movements calm and efficient, despite the fear Mason could see in her eyes. My car's closer, Sierra said. I'll drive. The next 20 minutes blurred together in a haze of traffic lights and emergency room protocols. Sierra drove with focused precision, while Mason sat in the back seat with Emma, monitoring her oxygen levels with the portable meter he always carried. Emma was conscious and alert, but her breathing was becoming more labored with each passing minute. It's okay, sweetheart, Mason murmured, stroking her hair. We're almost there. Just keep breathing for Daddy. Sierra pulled up to the emergency room entrance, and Mason rushed inside with Emma while Sierra parked the car. The triage nurse took one look at Emma's condition and whisked them directly into a treatment room. No waiting, no paperwork delays. Dr. Martinez, Emma's regular pediatrician, appeared within minutes, a response time that seemed miraculous until Mason realized someone must have called ahead to alert the medical team. "How long has she been symptomatic?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Already." Listening to Emma's chest with her stethoscope. "About 20 minutes. It came on fast. Her oxygen saturation is dropping. We need to start a breathing treatment immediately." The next hour was controlled chaos. Nurses administered medications, respiratory therapists set up oxygen equipment, and Emma endured it all with the stoic patience of a child who'd been through medical emergencies before. Mason held her hand throughout the treatments, talking to her in the calm voice that had helped Sierra through her panic attack months ago. Sierra appeared in the doorway just as Emma's breathing began to stabilize. She'd clearly been crying, her makeup smeared and her hands shaking slightly, but her voice was steady when she asked, "How is she?" "Better," Dr. Martinez reported. "Her oxygen levels are improving, and the bronchodilators are taking effect. We'll want to monitor her for a few more hours, but I think she's going to be fine." Sierra sank into the chair beside Mason's, relief evident in every line of her body. "I was so scared," she whispered, watching her struggle to breathe. "Welcome to my world," Mason said softly. "This is what loving Emma looks like sometimes. Emergency rooms and oxygen tanks, and being terrified that this time might be different. How do you do it? How do you function with that kind of fear?" Mason looked at his daughter, who was now breathing easier and trying to interest the oxygen mask in a game of peekaboo. "You learn that love is bigger than fear, that watching her laugh and learn and grow is worth every moment of terror." Nurse brought paperwork for Mason to sign, insurance forms and treatment authorizations that had become routine over the past year. But when she returned with the billing information, her expression was puzzled. "Mr. Hale, I'm showing that all charges for today's treatment have been covered by Emma's medical trust fund. There's no copay or deductible." Mason looked at Sierra, who was studying the floor with intense concentration. "The trust fund you established," he said quietly. "I wanted to make sure cost was never a factor in Emma's care," Sierra replied without looking up. "I wanted you to be able to focus on her instead of worrying about money." "Sierra, I know what you're going to say. That it's too much, that you didn't ask for it, that you can take care of your own family. But Mason, this isn't charity. It's love, and love doesn't come with limits or conditions." Emma chose that moment to reach for Sierra, making the little grabbing motions that meant she wanted to be held. Sierra gathered her carefully, mindful of the oxygen cannula and monitoring wires. "Is he scared?" Emma asked, patting Sierra's face with the concern that children showed when adults displayed emotions they didn't understand. "A little scared," Sierra admitted, "but better now that you're feeling better." "Kiss better?" Sierra pressed a gentle kiss to Emma's forehead, and Emma smiled with satisfaction, apparently convinced that adult problems could be solved as easily as childhood hurts. Dr. Martinez returned with discharge instructions and a prescription for a new inhaler. "Emma's episode was likely triggered by the excitement and activity of the day," she explained. "Her condition is well managed overall, but stress and overstimulation can sometimes cause flare-ups." "Will she be okay for future events like today?" Sierra asked. "With proper precautions, absolutely. The key is recognizing early symptoms and having a response plan in place." Dr. Martinez looked between Mason and Sierra with the assessing gaze of someone who'd seen many family dynamics in her years of practice. "Emma's fortunate to have two adults who clearly prioritize her well-being." Mason started to correct the assumption that Sierra was Emma's stepmother, then stopped, because in every way that mattered, Sierra had shown up as family today. She'd driven them to the hospital without hesitation, had stayed through the uncertainty and fear, had advocated for Emma's care with the fierce protectiveness of someone who loved her. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Sierra helped Mason gather their belongings while Emma dozed in the wheelchair, exhausted from the day's medical drama. "Sierra," Mason said as they waited for the elevator, "what you did today, is what anyone would have done. No, it's not. Most people would have called 911 and stayed out of the way. You stepped up like... Mason paused, searching for the right words. Like family. Sierra's eyes filled with tears again. Is that what we are? Family? Mason looked at this woman who'd driven his daughter to the emergency room without being asked, who'd established a medical trust fund to ensure Emma's care was never compromised, who'd held steady through a crisis that would have sent many people running. I think we've been family for a while, he said. I was just too scared to admit it. The elevator doors opened, and as they rode down to the parking garage, Emma stirred in Sierra's arms. Home? She asked sleepily. Yes, sweetheart, Mason replied. We're going home, all of us. Mason and Sierra exchanged a look over Emma's head, and in that moment, Mason made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. All of us, he confirmed. Sierra's smile was radiant despite her exhaustion. All of us, she repeated like a promise. As they walked through the parking garage together, Mason carrying the medical equipment, Sierra carrying Emma, all of them moving as a unit. Mason realized that family wasn't something you planned or scheduled or negotiated. It was something that happened in moments of crisis and joy, in hospital rooms and construction sites, in the quiet spaces between fear and love. They'd built something real together, the three of them. Something that could weather panic attacks and medical emergencies and the complicated process of learning to trust each other. Something worth fighting for, worth believing in, worth calling home. 6 months later, Mason stood in the kitchen of their new house, watching Sierra help Emma water the seedlings they'd planted in the community garden that now flourished behind the Helping Hands Community Center. The house was modest by Sierra's standards, a 3-bedroom cottage with a fenced yard and enough space for Emma to run, but it felt like everything they'd never dared to dream of. The keys Sierra had pressed into his palm a month ago weren't just brass and metal. They represented a new beginning, built on honesty, trust, and the gradual understanding that love didn't always follow logical timelines or conventional rules. "Daddy, look!" Emma called from the window, pointing to a butterfly that had landed on her small watering can. At 2 years old, she was speaking in full sentences and had developed an impressive vocabulary that included words like foundation, community. In Cizi's office, where she spent afternoons coloring, while Sierra worked on expanding their programs to 2 more cities. The transformation in Sierra had been gradual but profound. She still carried her phone everywhere and occasionally took calls during dinner, but she'd learned to set boundaries that protected their family time. Her assistant, Patricia, had become a frequent visitor, drawn by Emma's charm and Sierra's new approach to work-life balance that somehow made everything more efficient rather than less. Mason's role as co-director had evolved beyond his initial consulting work. He now oversaw 3 community centers, managed a staff of 12, and spoke regularly at conferences about sustainable support models for single-parent families. The irony wasn't lost on him that Sierra's deception had led him to the most meaningful work of his life. Emma's health had stabilized with consistent medical care and the reduced stress of financial security. Her emergency inhaler lived in Mason's pocket, but they hadn't needed it in 2 months. Dr. Martinez credited the improvement to both better medication management and the stability that came from having 2 attentive parents who could tag team. The demanding schedule of a chronically ill child. How did the board meeting go? Mason asked as Sierra and Emma came through the back door, both of them sporting dirt under their fingernails and matching grins. They approved funding for the Phoenix Center, Sierra reported, lifting Emma to the sink to wash her hands. Margaret thinks we'll be ready to break ground in the fall. That's incredible. It's necessary, Sierra corrected, drying Emma's hands with the patience that had become second nature to her. There's a waiting list of 300 families in that area alone. Mason watched Sierra interact with Emma, still amazed by how naturally she'd adapted to the rhythms of life with a toddler. She'd learned to negotiate with a 2-year-old about vegetables, to read the same book 17 times without showing impatience, to hold Emma during nightmares with the steady presence that only came from genuine love. "Sisi," Emma announced solemnly, "I want to show you my picture." She led Sierra to the refrigerator where her latest artistic creation was displayed, with the pride of place usually reserved for masterpieces. It was a crayon drawing of their family, 3 figures holding hands in front of their house, with a dog that didn't exist yet, but Emma insisted they needed. "Tell me about your picture," Sierra said, crouching down to Emma's eye level. "That's you and that's Daddy, and that's me and that's our dog when we get one." "What kind of dog should we get?" "A big one that likes kids and doesn't chew shoes." Sierra looked up at Mason with raised eyebrows. "Apparently we're getting a dog." "Apparently we are," Mason agreed, unable to say no to Emma's hopeful expression, or Sierra's amused smile. Later that evening, after Emma was asleep and they'd finished the dishes together, Mason and Sierra sat on their back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. It had become their routine 30 minutes of quiet conversation that helped them transition from the day's responsibilities to simply being together. "I got a call from my mother today," Sierra said, curled against Mason's side on the porch. "Swing he'd built last month. How did that go?" "Better than usual. She's finally stopped asking when I'm going to find someone appropriate and started asking when she can meet Emma properly." Mason had met Sierra's parents once, at a stiff dinner, that had confirmed everything Sierra had told him about transactional family relationships. But her mother's recent interest in Emma suggested that even the most entrenched patterns could shift when genuine love was involved. "What did you tell her?" "That she's welcome to visit any time, but she needs to understand that this is our life. Now, no judgments about my choices, no suggestions about how we should be doing things differently. And she said she'd like to come for Emma's birthday next month. She wants to bring presents." Emma's second birthday was shaping up to be a significant celebration. The community center staff had volunteered to help with decorations. Margaret was coordinating with the families they served to create a party that felt more like a community festival. And Mason was planning a surprise visit from Emma's favorite children's musician. "She'll love having a grandmother who spoils her," Mason said. "My mother doesn't know how to spoil children. She knows how to buy expensive things that are supposed to represent affection. Then maybe Emma can teach her the difference." Sierra laughed, the sound carrying across their small yard and mixing with the evening songs of birds settling into trees that had been there longer than any of the houses in their neighborhood. "How did I get so lucky?" she asked quietly. "Lucky how?" "Lucky enough to find you, lucky enough that you were willing to take a chance on someone who'd made such a mess of everything." Mason tightened his arms around her, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. "I think luck had less to do with it than stubbornness," he said. "Mine and yours." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you were stubborn enough to keep helping, even when I was too proud to accept it gracefully. And I was stubborn enough to keep believing that good people existed, even when my experience suggested otherwise." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled around them, the porch light casting a warm circle that felt like the boundary of their own private world. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their neighborhood, children playing, lawn mowers finishing evening yard work, the general bustle of families settling into evening routines. "Mason," Sierra said eventually, her voice carrying a note of nervousness that had become rare as she'd grown more comfortable with their relationship. "Yeah, I love you." It wasn't the first time she'd said it, but each time still felt like a small miracle to Mason. Sierra Wrenfield, who could buy and sell small countries, who commanded respect in boardrooms across the nation, who could have anyone she wanted, had chosen him, had chosen their small, complicated, beautiful life together. "I love you too," he replied, meaning it with an intensity that sometimes surprised him. "Even when I get obsessive about foundation budgets?" "Especially then." even when I schedule Emma's playdates like board meetings, as long as you remember that 2-year-olds don't actually follow schedules. Sierra laughed again, and Mason felt the familiar surge of gratitude for whatever series of accidents and intentions had brought them together. Her panic attack at the airport, his willingness to help a stranger, her fear-driven deception, his stubborn pride, all of it had led to this moment on their porch, planning their daughter's birthday party and debating the merits of various dog breeds. "Cece! Daddy!" Emma's voice carried from her bedroom window, accompanied by the sound of small feet hitting the floor. "Duty calls," Sierra said, already standing to respond to whatever crisis or curiosity had interrupted Emma's bedtime. "I'll go," Mason offered, but Sierra was already heading inside. "She asked for both of us," Sierra called over her shoulder. "That usually means she's either scared or plotting something." Mason followed Sierra upstairs, finding Emma standing in her crib with her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest and an expression of serious concern on her face. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Sierra asked, lifting Emma into her arms. "I forgot to say goodnight to the flowers," Emma announced, as if this was a crisis of epic proportions. Sierra and Mason exchanged the look that parents shared when faced with toddler logic that was simultaneously irrational and utterly serious. To the small person expressing it, "Would you like to say goodnight to them from the window?" Sierra suggested. Emma nodded solemnly, and Sierra carried her to the bedroom window that overlooked their small garden. Emma pressed her face to the glass and whispered, "Good night, flowers. Sleep good." Crisis averted, they tucked Emma back into her crib with stories and songs, and the elaborate bedtime ritual that had evolved over months of Sierra learning to be a parent alongside Mason. As they turned off the light and closed her door, Mason reflected on how naturally Sierra had stepped into their lives, how seamlessly she'd become part of their family unit. "Thank you," he said as they walked back. "Downstairs." "For what?" "For choosing us, for staying when things got complicated, for loving Emma like she's yours." Sierra stopped at the bottom of the stairs, turning to face him with an expression of such love and contentment that Mason felt his chest tighten with emotion. "She is mine," Sierra said simply. "You both are. That's what family means, choosing each other every day, building something together that's bigger than what any of us could create alone." As they settled back onto the porch, swing, Mason thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. The struggles and fears, the deceptions and forgiveness, the gradual building of trust that could weather medical emergencies and media attention, and the daily challenges of blending very different worlds into something new. Emma's drawing was right. They were different pieces that had learned to stick together. And sometimes, Mason thought as Sierra curled against his side and the stars appeared in the darkening sky, the most beautiful things were built from unlikely materials by people brave enough to believe in second chances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, foundation meetings and toddler tantrums, and the endless logistics of building a life together. But tonight, sitting on their porch with their daughter sleeping safely upstairs and the future stretching ahead of them full of possibility, Mason felt like the luckiest man alive. Not because Sierra had money, but because she'd chosen to build something real with him. Not because their love story was simple, but because it was true, and that, Mason had learned, was worth everything.